He was simply doing his night job, digging a grave by hand, just as he had done for many years. But the shovel didn't hit soil. Beneath the cemetery were thick blue cables, and when he followed where they led, he was shocked. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. For most of his life, the man had measured time not in years or seasons, but in layers of soil. He could remember where his hands had first learned the weight of a shovel, how the resistance of earth changed with depth, how certain smells belonged only to freshly opened ground. Long before the cemetery became his place of work, the ground itself had been his teacher. He had grown up in neighborhoods where buildings were temporary, but land endured, where people came and went, yet the earth remained, indifferent and patient. Loss had entered his life early, not as a dramatic rupture, but as a quiet subtraction, one presence gone, then another, until absence itself felt ordinary. By the time he reached adulthood, death no longer frightened him. It simply existed, like gravity or weather. He did not arrive at the cemetery with ambition or plans. It began as a temporary job, a way to earn steady money when other work dried up. At first, he told himself it would last only a few months. But months turned into years, and years settled into routine. The cemetery sat at the edge of the city, older than most of the neighborhoods surrounding it, a patchwork of eras marked by stone, iron, and weathered inscriptions. Trees with thick roots leaned over graves older than the city's current name. The place carried a sense of order that appealed to him. Death here followed schedules, paperwork, procedures. There were rules, and the rules were followed. He learned quickly that he preferred the night shifts. During the day, families arrived, supervisors watched, machines roared. At night, the cemetery returned to itself. The city's noise faded, replaced by distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves. Under artificial light, the ground revealed its true nature. Shadows softened edges. Sounds traveled differently. The work became quieter, almost meditative. No one questioned his methods in the dark. No one rushed him. From the beginning, he refused heavy machinery. Others joked about it, said he was stubborn, old-fashioned. He let them talk. Machines tore through soil without listening. They crushed roots, snapped through layers that had taken decades to settle. A shovel required patience. With a shovel, he could feel when the earth changed, when it resisted unnaturally, when something beneath the surface did not belong. He trusted his hands more than engines. He trusted silence more than speed. Night after night, he repeated the same motions, measuring, cutting, lifting, setting soil aside in neat piles. He developed small rituals without realizing it at first. He always paused before the first dig, letting his eyes adjust, listening to the quiet. He always worked from the same side, letting the light fall across the pit in a way that revealed texture and depth. He judged distance not with tape, but with his own body, knowing exactly how deep a grave needed to be because he had dug hundreds before it. Over time, the cemetery began to feel less like a place of mourning and more like a map. He knew which sections belonged to which decades. He knew where the ground stayed damp longer after rain, where roots were thickest, where the soil grew unexpectedly compact. He noticed patterns others ignored. Certain plots were requested more often than others. Certain areas saw burials at regular intervals, even when nearby sections remained untouched for months. At first, these observations meant nothing to him. He did not question them. Cemeteries followed their own logic, shaped by management decisions, by availability, by paperwork lost and found. Still, the patterns lingered at the edges of his awareness. He noticed that many of the people buried along a particular stretch shared similarities. Their headstones were modest, their names rarely accompanied by dates of marriage or lists of relatives. Many graves bore only a name, a date of birth, and a date of death. No flowers appeared long after burial. No visitors lingered. He did not judge. People died alone all the time. The city was full of those who passed through life quietly and left just as quietly. The official paperwork almost always listed the same cause: natural causes, heart failure, age-related complications, words that closed files neatly. As the years passed, his body aged, but his work remained steady. His hands grew stronger, more precise. His back learned the limits of strain. He learned how to conserve energy, how to let gravity do part of the work. He rarely spoke while working. Silence suited him. It allowed him to notice small things, like how the ground sometimes felt different beneath certain plots. Not softer or harder exactly, but more deliberate, as if shaped by intent rather than time. He had no reason to dwell on it. The cemetery was old. It had been repaired, expanded, modified countless times. Beneath it ran water lines, drainage systems, forgotten pipes. Cities layered themselves like sediment. That was normal. He told himself this whenever the soil resisted his shovel in ways that felt wrong, whenever the earth gave off a faint vibration that disappeared when he stopped digging. The night the story truly began did not announce itself as different. The request came through the usual channels: an unclaimed body, burial scheduled quickly, quietly. The name meant nothing to him. The paperwork was complete. The plot assigned lay along the familiar stretch where he had worked many times before. The air that night was cool and still. The city lights glowed faintly beyond the cemetery fence. He set up his lamp, rolled his shoulders, and began. The first layers of soil gave way easily, dark and loose. He worked steadily, letting the rhythm guide him. Minutes passed, then an hour. His shovel struck something that did not sound like stone. The sensation traveled up the handle and into his hands. It was not a sharp impact, but a dull, controlled resistance. He stopped immediately. He had learned long ago that forcing the shovel after such a signal led to damage, to broken tools, to mistakes that could not be undone. He knelt and brushed soil aside carefully. Beneath the dirt lay a smooth, flat surface. Concrete. Not old, cracked concrete, but clean, dense, poured with intention. He uncovered more of it, tracing the edge. The slab extended beyond the width of the grave. It did not belong there. For a moment, he considered covering it back up and reporting an obstruction. That would have been the simplest path, but simplicity had never guided his decisions. He studied the surface under the lamp's glow. There were no markings, no signs of decay. The concrete looked younger than the surrounding earth, younger than many of the graves above it. He cleared more soil along one edge and felt the temperature change. Beneath the slab, the air seemed cooler. As he brushed away the last of the dirt, color appeared. Blue. Not the faded blue of paint or cloth, but a deep industrial shade. Thick cables lay beneath the concrete, bundled neatly, running parallel to one another. He stared at them for a long time. He had seen cables before. Cities were full of them, but these were different. Too thick, too carefully arranged. They ran straight, uninterrupted, disappearing beneath the surrounding graves as if the cemetery had grown around them rather than the other way around. He touched one briefly. It vibrated faintly, alive with a low hum that vanished the moment he pulled his hand away. The realization settled slowly. Whatever lay beneath this ground was active. Not abandoned, not forgotten. He stood and looked across the cemetery. Rows of headstones stretched into the darkness, silent and unmoving. Above ground, everything appeared unchanged. Below, something else existed, hidden, deliberate, enduring. He did not fill the grave that night. Instead, he covered the cables carefully, restoring the soil as closely as he could to its original state. By the time he finished, the surface looked untouched. Only he knew what lay beneath. As he packed his tools and turned off the lamp, the cemetery felt different. Not threatening, not alive, but altered, as if a boundary he had never seen before had quietly dissolved. He walked away with soil still clinging to his boots, aware that the ground he had trusted for so many years had just revealed the first sign that it held more than the dead. The night swallowed him as he left, but the hum beneath the earth remained, steady and patient, waiting. He returned the following night with the same tools, the same lamp, the same deliberate pace, yet nothing about the cemetery felt the same. The discovery he had covered the night before had not faded with rest or daylight. It followed him through the hours he spent away, pressing against his thoughts without urgency, without panic, simply present. He did not tell himself stories about conspiracies or hidden dangers. He had learned long ago that imagination distorted reality. What mattered was the ground, and the ground had revealed something that did not belong. The new burial assignment waited for him in a nearby section, routine and unremarkable. Another unclaimed body, another file closed cleanly. The name meant nothing to him, just as the name from the night before had meant nothing. He set his lamp, checked the angle of the light, and began. The shovel entered the soil smoothly. The earth responded the way it always had, loosening under steady pressure, releasing the familiar scent of damp minerals and roots. He worked with the same rhythm he had refined over years, careful not to rush, careful not to wander. Yet his senses were sharper now. Every vibration felt amplified. Every shift in resistance drew his attention. He measured depth more frequently, pausing to assess layers, noticing transitions he might once have ignored. He told himself he was being cautious, nothing more. The concrete slab from the previous night had proven that caution was justified. As he dug deeper, the soil changed. The loose upper layers gave way to compacted earth, then to something firmer, arranged rather than settled. He slowed. The shovel struck again, the same dull resistance traveling through the handle. He stopped instantly, breath held without conscious effort. He knelt and brushed the soil aside. Concrete stared back at him, identical in texture and finish to the slab he had uncovered before. Its edges were clean, its surface unmarred. He traced the outline with his fingers, feeling the same unnatural coolness beneath the earth. This time, he did not hesitate. He cleared a narrow channel along one side, careful not to damage what lay below. Blue appeared again, thick cables bundled in precise formation, running straight and true. They did not curve to accommodate graves. The graves had been placed to accommodate them. The realization did not arrive with shock, but with clarity. The pattern he had sensed over years, the subtle alignment of plots, the repeated names and causes of death, all of it began to rearrange itself into something coherent. He stood and looked towards the grave from the previous night. The distance between the two was not random. He paced it out, counting steps. Then he walked farther along the same invisible line, stopping where another grave rested, one he had dug months earlier. He knelt and scraped at the surface, just enough to test the ground. The resistance came almost immediately. By the time the night ended, he had confirmed what he feared to name. Beneath a series of graves, spaced carefully across decades, ran the same reinforced concrete and the same blue cables. They formed a line, not merely a cluster. A deliberate path cut through the cemetery, indifferent to the dead above it. Sleep did not come easily after that. When it did, it was shallow and fragmented. Images of soil layers and cables bled into one another, repeating without resolution. He woke before dawn and sat in silence, letting the unease settle into something usable. Fear was useless. Curiosity was dangerous. What remained was responsibility. Over the following nights, he began to observe more than he dug. He walked the cemetery with purpose, tracing routes that only existed in his mind. He studied the spacing of headstones, the subtle shifts in alignment that would go unnoticed by anyone without his familiarity with the ground. He memorized dates. He noted the decades when burials along the line increased, then thinned, then resumed. The pattern matched nothing as simple as population growth or administrative change. He accessed old records during quiet hours, not through hacking or force, but through patience. The cemetery's archives were poorly maintained. Boxes stacked and restacked over years, labels faded, handwriting inconsistent. He read slowly, absorbing details others skimmed. Names repeated certain characteristics. Ages clustered within narrow ranges. Occupations, when listed, tended towards those without public visibility. The causes of death never deviated from natural explanations, never suggested accident or violence. He did not leap to conclusions. He assembled facts the way he assembled soil piles, carefully, deliberately, aware that a single careless assumption could collapse the structure he was building in his mind. Still, the shape emerging from the evidence could not be denied. The cemetery had not merely been used as a burial ground. It had been integrated into something else. One night, standing near the edge of the aligned graves, he felt the faint vibration again, a hum so subtle it could be mistaken for imagination. He knelt and pressed his palm flat against the ground. The sensation grew clearer, steadier. Something below was active, constant, unaffected by the passage of time above it. He realized then that the graves themselves were markers, not endpoints. They did not simply cover what lay beneath. They legitimized it. No one questioned digging in a cemetery, but no one dug deeper than required. The dead ensured privacy. The thought stayed with him as he continued his work. Each burial now felt layered, not just in soil, but in meaning. Every coffin lowered into the ground sealed not only a body, but a secret. The cemetery was no longer just a place of rest. It was infrastructure. The question that pressed against him was not who had built it. Whoever they were likely gone. The question was how far it extended and whether it was still growing. The graves along the line ended near the western fence, but beyond the cemetery lay the city itself. Streets, buildings, utilities. If the cables continued beyond the boundary, the cemetery was only a segment of a much larger system. He found himself avoiding certain areas instinctively, gravitating toward others. The ground seemed to guide him now, its resistance speaking more clearly than before. He did not tell anyone what he had found. Words would have made it real in a way he was not ready to confront. Silence had always protected him. He trusted it now. As the nights passed, his sense of the cemetery shifted completely. What had once felt orderly now felt layered with intent. The graves were no longer isolated points, but nodes along a concealed route. The soil was no longer inert, but structured, engineered, purposeful. He moved through it with growing awareness, careful not to disturb more than necessary. By the end of the week, he accepted what he could no longer deny. The earth beneath the cemetery had stopped being earth long ago. It had been transformed into something else, something that used the dead as cover and time as camouflage. And he, through years of quiet labor, had become one of the few people who could read its surface and understand what lay below. The discovery did not bring him closer to answers. Instead, it opened a deeper uncertainty. If the line existed beneath the graves, there had to be a place where it led, a point where the cables converged or descended, a source, an access. As he left the cemetery one night, he paused near an old, neglected structure at the far end of the grounds, a stone enclosure rarely visited and rarely mentioned. It had always been there, part of the background, dismissed as obsolete. For the first time, he did not look past it. The ground beneath his feet hummed faintly, steady and patient, and he understood that the earth had not merely revealed itself to him, it had invited him to go deeper. By the time he accepted that the cemetery concealed a system rather than an anomaly, his way of moving through it had changed. He no longer walked between graves as a worker passing from task to task. He walked as someone reading a surface for signs invisible to others. Every headstone, every slight rise in the ground, every irregularity in spacing became part of a silent language he was learning to interpret. He began with memory. Years of labor had left maps in his mind more accurate than any blueprint stored in an office drawer. He remembered where the shovel had sunk too easily, where it had resisted without reason, where the soil had felt strangely uniform regardless of weather or season. He retraced those memories now, night after night, pacing slowly along paths that only existed because he had walked them hundreds of times before. He stopped often, standing still, letting his body recall sensations his mind had never bothered to name. The alignment became clearer the more he allowed himself to see it. Graves, dug decades apart, shared the same invisible axis. Older headstones leaned slightly, newer ones stood straight, yet the ground beneath them told the same story. The soil compacted in familiar layers, the depth at which resistance appeared identical from plot to plot. Even the roots behaved differently there, diverted subtly, growing around something they could not penetrate. He tested carefully, never digging deep enough to leave visible disturbance, never damaging a grave. Just enough to confirm what he already suspected. Again and again, the shovel met that same engineered resistance at the same depth. Beneath it, the same smooth concrete. Beneath that, the same blue cables, bundled and ordered, alive with a restrained vibration. As the nights passed, the line revealed itself not as a straight path, but as a deliberate curve, bending gently to follow the boundaries of the cemetery while ignoring its internal divisions. It cut through sections labeled and relabeled over the years, indifferent to administrative logic. The cemetery had grown around it, adapting without awareness, filling in space the way water fills a container, never questioning the shape it was given. He turned to the archives again, this time with a specific purpose. Not to learn who the dead had been, but how they had been chosen. He read burial records going back 40 years, then further. He made note of those interred along the line, comparing them to those buried just beyond it. The contrast sharpened with every page. The ones above the cables shared an absence of connection. Few visitors, few surviving relatives, often none at all. Their lives, as recorded on paper, ended cleanly, without loose threads. The causes of death repeated with unnatural consistency: heart failure, respiratory collapse, complications related to age. Even when the deceased were not elderly, the language smoothed away irregularity. Nothing that would demand investigation. Nothing that would draw attention. It was not that these people had been killed. That idea never took hold. It was worse than that. They had been selected. The realization settled slowly, like soil after rain. Someone at some point had identified individuals whose deaths would not disturb the surface of society. People whose passing would not echo. People who would be missed by no one loud enough to matter. Their bodies became markers, their graves seals, their lives endpoints in a process that extended beyond them. He began to think of the graves not as isolated events, but as coordinates. Each one marked a moment in time and space when something below had been accessed, measured, or fed. The cemetery was not simply covering the system, it was pacing it. The hum beneath the ground seemed stronger along the line, not louder, but more present. When he stood directly above it, the vibration was steady, unwavering, like a heartbeat that did not belong to any living thing. He pressed his palm to the earth again, feeling the faint resonance travel through his skin. The system was not dormant. It had not been abandoned. It was functioning exactly as intended. He wondered how many others had noticed and chosen not to see. Groundskeepers before him, contractors called in for repairs, inspectors passing through during the day. How many had felt the resistance in the soil and dismissed it as buried debris or old foundations? How many had accepted the explanation offered by habit and moved on? He understood then that his own habits had protected the secret. His refusal to use machines, his preference for precision over speed, his instinct to stop when the ground spoke back. The system did not require guards or fences. It required predictability. It required people like him to do their jobs without asking why the earth behaved the way it did. As he traced the line farther, he noticed something else. The burials along it were not evenly spaced in time. There were clusters, periods when graves appeared closer together, followed by stretches of relative absence. The rhythm suggested usage, increased activity during certain years, then reduction, then renewal. The cemetery had mirrored the pulse of whatever lay beneath it. He tried to correlate the clusters with events outside the cemetery: economic downturns, policy changes, shifts in population. The connections were indirect, never explicit, but patterns emerged. Times of increased isolation, times when people slipped through cracks more easily. The system had adapted to the surface world, feeding on its blind spots. The thought unsettled him more than the physical discovery ever had. This was not a relic of some abandoned project. It was something that had learned how to coexist with human systems without ever revealing itself. It used bureaucracy as camouflage. It used death as a constant, reliable event. One night, while standing near the western edge of the aligned graves, he followed the curve of the line with his eyes and imagined it continuing beyond the fence. The cemetery ended, but the city did not. Streets lay beyond, basements, utility corridors, foundations poured over decades. If the cables extended outward, they could disappear into the infrastructure of the city as seamlessly as they had into the cemetery. He realized then that the cemetery was not the center of the system. It was a segment, a controlled environment, a place where variables could be managed. Above ground, deaths were recorded and filed away. Below ground, something harvested what those deaths produced. The weight of that understanding pressed on him, not as fear, but as inevitability. He could no longer pretend ignorance. He could no longer tell himself this was an isolated anomaly. The line beneath the dead had structure, intention, and longevity. Yet, despite the growing clarity, one question remained unanswered. Where did the line lead downward? The graves marked horizontal access, but the system had to descend somewhere. There had to be a point where the cables dropped deeper, where data or power or whatever they carried was gathered and processed. His mind returned to the neglected structure at the edge of the grounds, the one he had paused beside nights earlier. It had always been part of the cemetery's background, dismissed as obsolete, too old to matter. But now, seen through the lens of the line, it took on new significance. It sat precisely where the curve of graves seemed to tighten, where the hum beneath his feet felt marginally stronger. He did not approach it yet. Understanding had taught him patience. Rushing now would risk exposure, damage, consequences he could not predict. Instead, he continued his work, digging where assigned, restoring soil carefully, leaving no trace of his investigations. To anyone watching, he remained exactly what he had always been, a quiet man with a shovel doing necessary work at night. Inside, however, his perception of the cemetery had transformed completely. It was no longer a resting place. It was a map, a surface layer masking an engineered reality below, and he, by virtue of time and attention, had learned to read it. The line beneath the dead did not demand his attention. It did not hurry him. It existed independently of his awareness, steady and patient. But now that he had seen it, truly seen it, he understood that his work could no longer remain only about burial. The ground had revealed its second function, and with that revelation came the certainty that the next step was not horizontal, but downward. The certainty that the line descended somewhere did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It settled into him gradually, shaping his thoughts the way water shapes stone. The cemetery had revealed its horizontal logic with patience, allowing him to see how graves aligned, how time itself had been arranged above an invisible structure. Now, the question of depth pressed forward with the same quiet insistence. Systems did not exist only in planes. They converged, they collected, they required centers. He began by resisting the urge to act. Years of manual labor had taught him that haste damaged more than tools. He watched instead. He walked the perimeter of the aligned graves repeatedly, at different hours of the night under different conditions. Rain softened the soil and sharpened contrasts. Cold tightened the ground and amplified vibration. Heat flattened sensation, forcing him to rely on memory. Through it all, the hum beneath the earth remained constant, unaffected by surface conditions, steady as something designed to endure. His attention kept returning to the neglected structure at the western edge of the cemetery. It was not remarkable at first glance. A small stone enclosure, partially sunken, its entrance sealed long ago with a rusted iron door that no longer opened. Official records labeled it as an obsolete maintenance vault from an earlier expansion, no longer in use. No one visited it. No one mentioned it. Its presence had faded into the background of the cemetery's landscape, overlooked precisely because it had always been there. Now, seen through the logic of the line, its placement felt deliberate. The curve of graves tightened as it approached the structure, as if drawn inward. The ground nearby carried a subtle difference, a faint increase in vibration detectable only when he stood still long enough to feel it through his boots. Roots avoided the area. The soil compacted unnaturally close to the surface. He approached it one night without tools, carrying only his lamp. He did not touch the door. He did not force entry. He studied the stonework instead, tracing seams with his eyes. The masonry bore signs of modification inconsistent with its stated age. Mortar newer than surrounding stone. Reinforcements disguised beneath weathering. This was not abandonment. It was concealment. The decision to enter did not feel like a choice. It felt like the next logical movement in a process that had begun long before he understood it. He waited several nights, ensuring routines remained unchanged, ensuring no one observed him lingering where he did not belong. When he finally returned with tools, the cemetery lay quiet, the city distant and indifferent. He worked slowly, carefully removing debris and corrosion from the door's edges. The lock had been disabled, not broken, rendered irrelevant by time. With steady pressure, he eased the door inward. Air escaped from within, cool and stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of enclosed machinery. The sound that followed was unmistakable. A low, continuous hum, deeper and more concentrated than anything he had felt above ground. The passage descended steeply, cut cleanly through earth and reinforced with concrete. He moved downward with controlled steps, lamp angled to reveal texture and depth. The temperature dropped noticeably. Moisture condensed on the walls, not from groundwater seepage, but from controlled airflow. Ventilation, active and purposeful. As he descended, the sound grew clearer. Not chaotic, not loud, but layered. Systems operating in harmony. Fans, electrical currents. The controlled rhythm of something designed to run without interruption. The corridor opened into a larger space, and he stopped at the threshold, allowing his eyes to adjust. Rows of equipment extended beyond the reach of his lamp, their outlines sharp and intentional. Server racks stood in ordered lines, lights blinking in slow measured patterns. Thick blue cables fed into them from above, from the very line that ran beneath the graves. The connection was absolute. He stepped inside, boots echoing softly against the concrete floor. The air was dry and cool, filtered and circulated. The space bore none of the decay associated with abandoned underground rooms. This place was maintained, monitored, sustained, not by visible human presence, but by design. He moved between the racks, reading labels where they existed, noting serial numbers, timestamps, maintenance logs printed and laminated, updated years ago and left in place. The technology spanned generations, newer components integrated seamlessly with older frameworks. This was not a single installation frozen in time. It had evolved. At the far end of the room, the cables converged, descending further into reinforced channels. Screens mounted along the walls displayed streams of data, scrolling continuously. He did not understand the specifics at first glance, but the structure was clear. Inputs, storage, processing, outputs. A closed system, self-contained and autonomous. He realized then that this was not merely an extension of the cemetery. The cemetery was an interface, a controlled environment through which something essential was gathered. Above ground, death occurred in predictable, documentable ways. Below ground, those moments were captured, preserved, transformed into something usable. He stood still, listening. The hum filled the space, not intrusive but absolute. It had likely been present for decades, unnoticed by those walking above it. The earth muffled it. Routine buried it. The dead protected it. The scale of the installation unsettled him more than its existence. This was not the work of a small operation or a temporary project. It required planning, resources, permission, silence. It required trust in time itself to erase curiosity. And it had succeeded. He explored cautiously, careful not to touch anything unnecessarily. He noted emergency power systems, redundant cooling units, multiple data paths ensuring no single failure could bring the system down. Whatever this facility existed to do, it had been designed to survive neglect, to outlast oversight, to continue functioning long after its creators stepped away. The thought that no one actively monitored the facility now did not reassure him. Systems like this did not require supervision to remain dangerous. They required only continuity. He traced the cables back toward the ceiling, imagining them rising through the concrete shaft, splitting beneath graves, threading their way beneath markers of human finality. Each burial above represented not just an end, but a moment of input, a transfer. When he finally turned to leave, the realization settled fully. This place was not hidden because it was forgotten. It was hidden because it worked best when unseen. It did not need secrecy enforced by guards or alarms. It relied on the assumptions people carried about death, about burial, about what lay beneath places designated for rest. The climb back to the surface felt longer than the descent. Each step upward returned him to a world that now felt thinner, less substantial. When he emerged into the night air, the cemetery greeted him with a familiar stillness. Headstones stood unchanged. The ground appeared inert. Nothing above ground acknowledged the machinery humming below. He closed the door carefully, restoring its appearance as closely as possible. By the time he stepped away, the structure looked as neglected and irrelevant as it always had. Anyone passing would see nothing worth questioning. But he knew now that beneath the graves, beneath the rituals and records and silence, a system persisted. It gathered something from death itself, processed it, stored it, and continued without pause. The cemetery was not merely a cover. It was a necessary component. As he resumed his work in the following nights, the weight of that knowledge altered everything. Each grave he dug now existed in 2 dimensions at once. Above, a body returned to Earth. Below, a network received another silent contribution, and he understood that what he had uncovered was not the end of the mystery, but its foundation. The days that followed his descent into the underground facility passed with an unsettling calm. Nothing on the surface changed. The cemetery gates opened and closed at their usual hours. Paperwork continued to arrive, names typed neatly onto forms, dates aligned with schedules. Bodies came and went. Above ground, the world remained orderly and indifferent. Below, the system continued to hum, uninterrupted by his discovery, untouched by his presence. He understood quickly that whatever existed beneath the cemetery had been designed to endure observation. It did not react to being seen. It did not defend itself or conceal itself further. It simply continued. That realization troubled him more than any alarm or warning could have. Systems that expected discovery were far rarer than those that feared it. He began to return underground in small increments, never staying long enough to create a pattern, never touching more than he needed to. Each visit deepened his understanding, not through sudden revelation, but through accumulation. He read what he could, not personal messages or dramatic confessions, but technical documentation left behind because no one had bothered to remove it. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion and justification. It spoke only of processes, parameters, thresholds. At first, the data streams meant little to him. Columns of numbers updated continuously, marked by timestamps that aligned not with the present moment, but with recorded events above ground. He noticed the lag, the way inputs spiked briefly and then stabilized. When he compared those timestamps to burial records, the correspondence became impossible to ignore. Each surge in activity matched a death. Not the burial itself, but the moment of death recorded on official documents. The system was not responding to the presence of a body in the ground. It was responding to the act of dying. As he studied further, the scope of the experiment emerged with chilling clarity. The system was built to capture the final physiological transitions of the human body: heart rate decay, neural activity collapse, chemical shifts in blood and tissue, patterns that occurred only once at the precise boundary between life and death. Data that could never be recreated artificially, no matter how advanced technology became. Each individual buried along the line represented a data point, not a subject in the conventional sense, but a moment. A clean, uncontaminated instance of biological shutdown. The cemetery provided a controlled environment not because it housed the dead, but because it allowed death to occur without scrutiny. He realized then why the causes of death were always listed as natural. Natural deaths followed predictable trajectories. They were less likely to involve trauma, medication interference, or sudden disruption. The system did not accelerate death, it waited for it. Selection occurred long before burial, long before paperwork. The individuals had been identified as optimal candidates not because they were expendable, but because their deaths would be quiet. The ethics of the experiment were absent from the documentation. There were no justifications, no philosophical arguments, no expressions of doubt, only efficiency, only optimization. The project treated death as a resource, not to be feared or mourned, but to be measured and preserved. He learned that the system did not store identities. Names were irrelevant. Each dataset was indexed by time, by physiological signature, by environmental conditions. The person ceased to exist the moment their biological processes concluded. What remained was information, clean, precise, endlessly reusable. As he pieced together the timeline, it became clear that the experiment had spanned decades. Technology evolved, components were replaced, storage capacity expanded, but the core methodology remained unchanged. Capture, preserve, analyze, repeat. The system adapted seamlessly, integrating newer hardware without disrupting older data structures. Whoever designed it understood not only biology, but time itself. The most unsettling realization came when he recognized the absence of oversight. There were no recent logs indicating human intervention. Maintenance schedules ended years ago. Updates ceased. And yet, the system functioned flawlessly. Automated protocols handled failures. Redundancies compensated for decay. The experiment no longer required its creators. It had outlived them. He considered the possibility that the original purpose had already been fulfilled, that the data had been collected, analyzed, used, and that what remained was simply residue. But the system continued to collect. It continued to grow. That suggested that the data still mattered, or that the system no longer distinguished between purpose and process. He wondered what the information had been used for. Medical research, longevity studies, artificial intelligence trained on the precise mechanics of human shutdown, military applications, philosophical inquiries into consciousness. The possibilities were endless, and the documentation offered no answers. Outcomes were not recorded here, only inputs. In that absence, a more disturbing thought formed. The experiment might never have been about results. It might have been about accumulation, about building a complete map of human death, one data point at a time, without end. As he returned to the surface after each visit, the cemetery felt heavier. Each grave now carried a second meaning, invisible to visitors, unknown to families. The dead rested above a system that had reduced their final moments to entries in a database, not out of cruelty, but out of indifference. The system did not hate them. It did not value them either. He began to understand that legality had protected the experiment more effectively than secrecy. Nothing about the process violated explicit laws. People died naturally. Bodies were buried with proper documentation. No one was harmed beyond the inevitability of mortality. The system exploited a space where ethics had no clear jurisdiction. The thought haunted him as he continued his nightly work. He dug graves knowing that each new burial might one day align with the line, might one day become another silent contribution. He could not tell whether the selection process was still active, or whether the system simply waited for suitable deaths to occur on its own. Either possibility was equally unsettling. What troubled him most was not the scale of the experiment, but its emptiness. There was no sense of triumph, no culmination, just endless recording. The system did not celebrate knowledge, it consumed it. He began to see the cemetery not as a place of exploitation, but as a mirror. It reflected society's willingness to ignore what happened to those who left quietly. The experiment thrived not because it was hidden, but because it was aligned with neglect already present above ground. By the time he reached this understanding, he no longer questioned why the system had chosen the cemetery. He questioned why it had taken him so long to see it. Death had always been data. The system had simply formalized that truth. And now that he knew, fully and without illusion, the experiment no longer felt distant. It felt personal, because understanding brought with it an unavoidable realization. The system did not need his consent to continue, but it did need his silence. The knowledge did not sit within him as a revelation so much as a slow recalibration. Once he understood what the system was and how long it had been functioning, he began to see himself differently within its scope. Nothing about his daily routine had changed on the surface. He still arrived at the cemetery at the same hour, unlocked the same gates, checked the same lists. His shovel still entered the soil with familiar resistance. Yet, beneath those repetitions, a quieter awareness took hold, threading through every movement. He was no longer merely working above a hidden mechanism. He was working as part of it. At first, he resisted that thought. He told himself that discovery did not equal participation, that observation did not imply consent. But denial had never lasted long in his life. The evidence was too consistent, too deeply embedded in years of routine. His habits had not only aligned with the system, they had preserved it. He began to replay memories he had never considered significant. The times supervisors suggested using machinery to speed up work, and he declined without argument. The instances when temporary workers damaged underground structures elsewhere in the city, and he had quietly warned against similar risks here. The subtle choices he made every night, stopping when the ground felt wrong, adjusting depth by instinct rather than instruction. Each decision, innocuous on its own, had contributed to maintaining the integrity of what lay below. He realized that the system did not require active protection. It required compatibility. It thrived because it existed within a framework of predictable human behavior. Cemeteries followed routines, workers followed habits, machines followed rules. The system had been built to fit inside those patterns so precisely that it became invisible. And he had been the ideal component. He possessed no authority that could threaten it, no curiosity that demanded explanation, no ambition that sought recognition. He worked alone at night, preferred silence, and avoided attention. His background offered no leverage. No one asked him questions, and he volunteered nothing. Even now, with the truth fully formed in his mind, he understood that speaking would not be simple. Knowledge required language, and language created consequences that could not be controlled. The realization did not produce guilt in the way he might have expected. He had not chosen this role consciously. He had not agreed to protect anything. Yet, a different emotion surfaced, heavier and more persistent. Responsibility without agency. He could not claim innocence because his actions mattered. But he could not claim intent either. The system had shaped itself around him as much as he had shaped his work around the ground. As days passed, he noticed subtle shifts in his own behavior. He found himself adjusting his routines with greater care, not to conceal his awareness, but to avoid disrupting equilibrium. He filled graves with the same precision as before, restored soil meticulously, erased signs of disturbance that might draw inspection. The cemetery's surface remained smooth, orderly, unremarkable. He understood now that this surface was not merely aesthetic. It was functional. At times, he wondered whether the system had anticipated someone like him, not an overseer, not a guardian, but a stabilizing presence, someone who ensured continuity through habit rather than instruction. The thought unsettled him, yet it fit the logic he had come to recognize. Systems that endured for decades did not rely on loyalty. They relied on inertia. He recalled moments when he had avoided certain sections of the cemetery without conscious reason. Nights when he felt an unexplainable reluctance to dig deeper in specific plots, choosing instead to adjust placement slightly, preserving unseen structures without knowing why. Those instincts had not been random. They had been informed by subtle cues, by vibrations felt through his hands, by resistance sensed through muscle and bone. His body had learned the system before his mind ever named it. That realization blurred the boundary between coincidence and design. Had the system merely benefited from his presence, or had it shaped his preferences over time? He dismissed the idea of manipulation quickly. The system did not need to influence thought. It needed only to exist long enough for human behavior to adapt around it. He began to understand that leaving his job would change nothing. Another worker would take his place. Perhaps someone less careful. Perhaps someone more curious. The system would adapt, as it always had. If disruption occurred, it would not be because of him, but because chance finally collided with design. His presence delayed that collision. His absence might accelerate it. This understanding placed him in a quiet bind. Staying meant complicity through maintenance. Leaving meant abandoning control to unpredictability. Neither option felt moral. Both felt inevitable. He found himself thinking about the people buried along the line, about their lives before they became data points. He did not romanticize them. He did not imagine conversations or regrets. Instead, he considered the structure that had identified them as suitable. The system had not created their isolation. It had exploited it. It functioned because society already allowed certain lives to end without echo. That, more than anything, stripped the situation of simplicity. There was no villain to confront, no single decision to reverse. The system existed because it reflected existing priorities. Efficiency over reflection, order over scrutiny, silence over discomfort. He began to feel that his own life fit the same pattern. He had moved through the world quietly, without leaving marks that demanded explanation. His work supported structures others ignored. His presence was tolerated because it was unobtrusive. In that sense, he and the system were aligned not by intention, but by design. The thought that he could be replaced without consequence did not frighten him. What unsettled him was the realization that the system did not require belief, secrecy, or enforcement. It required only a continuation. As long as people kept dying quietly, as long as paperwork kept flowing, as long as graves kept being dug to precise depths by hands that listened to the ground, it would endure. He carried this awareness with him through his nights, through the familiar motions of labor. Each grave felt heavier, not because of what it contained, but because of what it supported. He did not alter his work. Alteration would have drawn attention. Instead, he refined it, becoming even more exact, more consistent. If he was part of the mechanism, then precision was his only form of control. At times, standing alone under the lamp's pale glow, he wondered whether the system would ever need him to do more, whether discovery was itself a form of integration. The thought lingered without resolution. The system had no interface for communication. It did not acknowledge him. It did not need to. By the end of that period, one truth had settled beyond dispute. He could not separate himself from what lay beneath the cemetery. His work sustained it, and his knowledge bound him to it. He was no longer merely a witness. He was a variable within a machine that did not recognize morality, only continuity. And with that understanding came a deeper, quieter fear. Not fear of exposure or punishment, but fear of choice. Because knowing his role meant he would eventually have to decide whether to remain what he had become or attempt an action whose consequences he could neither predict nor escape. The fear that settled into him after accepting his place within the system was not sharp or paralyzing. It was slow, persistent, and heavy, like pressure applied evenly over time. It did not demand immediate action. It waited. The more he tried to ignore it, the more it clarified itself, shaping his thoughts into a single, unavoidable question. What, if anything, should be done? He approached that question the same way he approached the ground each night. Carefully, methodically, without rushing toward a conclusion that might collapse under its own weight. He understood that discovery alone had not changed the system. Knowledge, by itself, had no power unless it was carried outward, translated into action. And action, once taken, could not be undone. At first, the idea of exposure surfaced instinctively. He imagined authorities descending on the cemetery, machinery tearing through graves, lights flooding the underground facility, investigators cataloging servers, analysts poring over data, journalists constructing narratives that would reduce decades of silent accumulation into headlines and outrage. The vision carried a brief sense of relief, a fantasy of release from responsibility. If others knew, the burden would no longer rest on him alone, but that relief dissolved as quickly as it formed. He understood systems well enough now to know how such revelations unfolded. Evidence would be seized, servers would be powered down, or worse, wiped clean remotely before anyone reached them. The data, the true substance of the experiment, would vanish. The visible structure would be dismantled, blamed on defunct programs or forgotten contractors. Responsibility would diffuse upward and outward until it dissolved entirely. What would remain would not be justice, but erasure. He also knew that exposure would not restore dignity to the dead. Their final moments had already been converted into information, stored, replicated, possibly transmitted elsewhere. Revealing the facility would not undo that transformation. It would only ensure that whatever knowledge had been extracted would disappear into classified archives or private holdings, inaccessible and unexamined, stripped of context. The more he considered it, the clearer it became that destruction would serve no one except the illusion of resolution. The system had been designed to survive neglect. It would also survive outrage. If dismantled publicly, it would simply reemerge elsewhere, rebuilt with greater care, greater secrecy. Knowledge of its existence would not end the practice, it would refine it. Another possibility emerged slowly, heavier than the first: sabotage without exposure. A quiet disruption, a misalignment introduced subtly into the system. A failure that could not be immediately traced or corrected. He considered this option with grim seriousness. He understood enough now to imagine how fragile even the most redundant systems could be when disrupted from within. Yet, sabotage carried its own consequences. The system was autonomous, but it was not isolated. Disrupting it could have effects he could not predict. Data loss might be immediate or delayed. Failures could cascade unpredictably. Worse, intervention might trigger safeguards designed precisely to prevent interference. He did not know whether the system could detect anomalies. He did not know whether it could respond. And if sabotage succeeded, what then? The experiment would end, but so would the accumulation of knowledge it represented. He could not pretend that what had been gathered held no value. Understanding death at its most precise threshold could save lives as easily as it could exploit them. The absence of ethical framing in the documentation did not mean the data itself was without potential benefit. Destroying it would not restore morality. It would only ensure ignorance. Silence, then, presented itself as the third path, not passive ignorance, but deliberate restraint. Continue as he had, preserving equilibrium, maintaining the surface order that allowed the system to persist without scrutiny. In this path, nothing changed outwardly. Graves would continue to be dug. Deaths would continue to be recorded. The system would continue its quiet harvest. This option weighed on him most heavily, not because it felt cowardly, but because it felt effective. Silence had already proven itself the most powerful force sustaining the system. Choosing it consciously would mean accepting a role he had never sought. It would mean carrying knowledge that could not be shared without consequence, bearing witness without intervention. He tested these possibilities against his own limits. He asked himself what he could endure. Exposure would cost him control. Sabotage would cost him certainty. Silence would cost him peace. The nights passed as he turned these questions over in his mind, again and again, refining them the way he refined his work, removing excess, discarding false options. He paid close attention to his own reactions, to the subtle shifts in his body when he imagined one path versus another. His instincts, sharpened by years of listening to the ground, guided him more reliably than abstract reasoning ever could. What ultimately decided him was not fear of punishment or hope for reward. It was the fragility of evidence. The system existed because it had been allowed to exist quietly. Any attempt to force it into the open would destroy the very thing that made it comprehensible. Without the system intact, there would be nothing to study, nothing to understand, nothing to question beyond speculation and rumor. He came to see that the most radical act available to him was not exposure or destruction, but preservation of truth without disclosure. To know fully and accurately, and to allow that knowledge to remain embedded where it could not be distorted or weaponized prematurely. It was not a heroic choice. It offered no absolution. It merely acknowledged reality as it was. With that realization, his decision formed without ceremony. He would not interfere. He would not reveal what he had found. He would continue his work exactly as before, with the same precision, the same restraint. He would allow the system to persist, not because he believed in it, but because dismantling it blindly would only replace one form of exploitation with another, less visible one. This choice did not bring him comfort. It brought him clarity. He understood that by choosing silence he accepted solitude. There would be no one to share the burden with, no one to confirm or deny his conclusions. The knowledge would remain his alone, shaping his perception without offering release. He would carry it as he carried the weight of soil each night, lifting and setting it down carefully, aware of its mass, respectful of its consequences. As he stood one night above a newly filled grave, smoothing the surface until it blended seamlessly with the surrounding ground, he felt no sense of resolution, only continuity. The cemetery remained quiet. The city beyond remained unaware. Beneath his feet, the system continued its measured work, indifferent to his thoughts, unchanged by his choice. He realized then that the decision he had made would never be tested publicly. There would be no moment of validation, no recognition. The choice would remain invisible, as hidden as the cables beneath the graves. Its impact would be measured only in absence. Absence of disruption, absence of exposure, absence of closure. And in that absence, he understood the final weight of what he had accepted. He had chosen to become a silent boundary between knowledge and action, a human threshold much like the one the system studied so obsessively, a point where understanding ended and restraint began. The ground beneath him hummed softly, steady and unbroken. The choice had been made, and no one, above or below, would ever know. After the decision settled into him, life did not fracture or reform. It aligned. The cemetery received him each night the way it always had, without acknowledgement or resistance. Gates creaked open. Lamps cast their limited circles of light. Paperwork waited on the desk, names already assigned to places in the ground. The continuity felt deliberate now, no longer neutral. He moved through it with the calm precision of someone who understood that repetition was not absence of change, but its most stable form. His work resumed its familiar cadence, yet perception altered everything. Where once he had seen isolated graves, he now saw intersections. Where he had seen rows, he saw pathways. The cemetery revealed itself as a surface diagram, each marker a node anchored to something far more intricate beneath. The dead rested above a system that did not distinguish between past and present, only between inputs and silence. He dug with the same care as before, but awareness sharpened his attention to detail. Soil was not merely soil. Each layer represented a threshold already crossed by countless others. Each shovel of earth removed was an action mirrored invisibly below, where data streams adjusted, storage expanded, and processes continued their endless calibration. He did not imagine this correspondence. He had seen it, traced it, confirmed it beyond doubt. The underground facility did not require his visits anymore. He did not descend again. There was nothing left to learn there that he did not already understand in principle. The system functioned autonomously, uninterested in observation. It did not seek validation. It did not respond to presence. Knowing when to stop was as important as knowing when to dig deeper, and he recognized that further intrusion would not deepen understanding. It would only create risk. Instead, he studied the surface. Over time, he began to perceive the cemetery as a living map, not alive in the organic sense, but active. New burials did not occur randomly. They adhered to availability, policy, convenience. Those forces, in turn, interacted subtly with the hidden line beneath. The system did not dictate placement overtly. It waited, allowing administrative decisions to drift into alignment. Where coincidence failed, time corrected. He noticed that as older sections filled and new ones opened, the line adjusted its influence without movement. The system did not extend itself aggressively. It allowed expansion to come to it. When new plots were added near its trajectory, they were quietly integrated. When expansion moved away, the line remained dormant, waiting for the cemetery to curve back. Patience, he understood, was the system's most effective mechanism. Each burial reinforced the structure's invisibility. Families focused on grief, logistics, closure. Workers focused on schedules and efficiency. No one questioned depth or resistance as long as the grave met regulations. The cemetery absorbed attention and dispersed it harmlessly. It was a perfect interface, absorbing human meaning while delivering human absence below. As months passed, he realized that the system had no endpoint. There was no completion threshold, no final data set that would signal fulfillment. Death would continue as long as life did. The experiment, if it could still be called that, had become an archive without closure. It accumulated not because it needed to, but because it could. He considered at times what might happen after he was gone. Another worker would arrive, someone less attentive perhaps, someone more hurried. The system would adapt. If disruption occurred, it would correct. If exposure threatened, it would withdraw, fragment, or transfer. He suspected that what lay beneath the cemetery was only one node among others, a localized concentration rather than a singular heart. Networks did not rely on centers. They relied on redundancy. That understanding changed how he viewed his own role over time. He was not a guardian. He was not a gatekeeper. He was a stabilizing variable, temporary by nature, replaceable by design. The system did not depend on him specifically. It depended on the persistence of ordinary labor, the predictability of human routines, the willingness of society to accept death as an administrative event rather than a moment worthy of scrutiny. He began to think of the cemetery not as a place of rest, but as a threshold environment, a zone where life transitioned into documentation, where the final act of existence was reduced to form and procedure. Beneath that reduction, something else gathered what could not be captured on paper. Signals, patterns, traces of processes that vanished too quickly for conventional observation. The system did not mourn that loss. It extracted value from it. There were nights when the weight of that knowledge pressed harder than usual. Standing alone beside a freshly filled grave, smoothing soil until no sign of disturbance remained, he sometimes felt the quiet accusation of awareness. Not guilt, exactly, but proximity. He stood closer to the truth than anyone else, yet remained silent by choice. That silence did not absolve him. It defined him. Still, he did not regret the decision. Regret required imagining an alternative that led to clarity or justice. He saw no such path. Any action he might have taken would have fractured the system into shadows harder to detect and easier to deny. By remaining where he was, by continuing to see without interfering, he preserved the possibility that understanding might one day extend beyond him, intact and uncorrupted by panic or ambition. In moments of rare abstraction, he wondered whether the system would ever intersect with something that forced its emergence. A technological failure too visible to ignore. A legal challenge that pierced the veil of procedure. A shift in cultural attention toward death itself. These possibilities remained distant, theoretical. The system had survived decades by avoiding confrontation, not by winning it. As time continued its steady erosion, his own presence blended further into the cemetery's fabric. New supervisors came and went. Policies changed. Sections were renamed. Through it all, the ground remained constant, and his relationship to it remained unchanged. He listened. He adjusted. He worked. He noticed, eventually, that the hum beneath the earth no longer startled him. It had become part of the landscape, as familiar as the sound of wind through trees or traffic beyond the fence. The system's persistence ceased to feel intrusive. It simply was. A parallel continuity running beneath human time, indifferent to recognition. The final understanding arrived not as revelation, but as acceptance. The cemetery was not hiding a secret. It was performing a function. It converted endings into continuity. It ensured that nothing truly vanished, not even the most unremarked life. Every death contributed to a structure that did not honor or condemn, only record and persist. Standing at the edge of the grounds one night, he looked back across the rows of markers, the geometry of stone and earth laid out under pale light. Above ground, the cemetery appeared still, resolved, complete. Below, the network extended beyond sight, threading its way through layers of time and intention. He turned away without ceremony, locking the gate behind him as he always had. Tomorrow night he would return. Graves would need digging. Soil would need smoothing. The work would continue. And beneath it all, unseen and uninterrupted, the network would endure. Patient as the earth itself, gathering what humanity released and waiting, as it always had, for the next quiet ending. If this story made you think twice about what lies beneath the surface, don't stop here. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story, the ones that go even deeper and uncover what most people never notice. Watch the next video on the channel and explore other stories that reveal hidden systems, buried truths, and quiet discoveries that change everything. Share this video with someone who loves mysteries like this. You never know what they'll see that you didn't.